The early morning light crept over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the open plains. John sat on the weathered porch of his small cabin, staring out at the land he had worked on for most of his life. He could feel the weight of the years in his bones, but it was the land that kept him going. The world around him was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the tall grass. John had never been a man of many words. He preferred the stillness of nature, the rhythm of the earth beneath his boots. But today, something was different. The air felt heavier, thick with tension. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The quiet was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. John's eyes narrowed as he stood, instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the porch post. He had been hearing rumors about a group of men moving through the area, causing trouble for anyone they came across. John didn't want to get involved, but the lawless men had a way of dragging you in whether you wanted to or not. As he moved to the side of the porch out of sight, he caught sight of them. 3 riders on horseback, dust kicking up behind them. They were moving fast, and from their rough appearance, it was clear they weren't friendly. They were too close to his land for comfort, and John's instincts told him to stay hidden, to wait and see if they'd pass by. But then he saw her. A woman, alone, running across the prairie. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt, and her eyes were wild with fear. She didn't seem to notice the men approaching her. She was too focused on the horizon, as if she were hoping for something, someone, to appear. John's heart skipped a beat. She looked like she was running for her life. Without thinking, John stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. He had to do something. The woman might have been miles away from safety, but she wasn't alone now. The men on horseback were still coming, but John was already on his feet, his rifle in hand. The woman turned suddenly, spotting him, and a look of shock crossed her face. She stopped in her tracks, unsure whether to keep running or to face him. "Please, help me," she said breathlessly, her voice barely audible. John froze, unsure what to do. There was a brief moment of hesitation, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of urgency. The riders were getting closer, their horses' hooves pounding the earth. They were shouting at the woman now, ordering her to stop. John's heart raced. He had to act quickly. He was a rancher, not a lawman. But he knew what it meant to protect what was his. And something about this woman, her fear, made him want to help her, even though he had no idea who she was or why she was running. "Stay back," he called out to the men, lifting his rifle. He aimed it toward the ground, a warning shot. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the air, but the men didn't slow down. One of them, a burly man with a long scar across his cheek, pulled his reins and stopped his horse just a few feet away from John. "Stay out of this, rancher," the man growled, his voice low and threatening. "This is none of your business." John didn't move. He kept his eyes on the man, his hand steady on the rifle. "I said, stay back," he repeated, his voice firm. The woman behind him was still frozen in place, her eyes darting between John and the approaching riders. She looked like she wanted to run again, but something was stopping her. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the feeling that for the first time in a long while, someone was standing up for her. "Look," the man on the horse said. "She's nothing but trouble. We're taking her back where she belongs. You don't want to get in the way of this, old man." John's grip tightened on the rifle. The sun was just beginning to rise fully, casting a golden light over the scene, but the tension was thick. "I'm not letting you take her," John said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, one that made the men on horseback pause. The burly man scowled, clearly not used to being challenged. "You think you can stop us?" he asked, his hand resting on the gun at his side. John didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just stood his ground, his rifle still pointed down at the ground but ready for whatever might come next. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the soft rustle of the wind. Then, without warning, the woman stepped forward, her eyes wide with fear but also a hint of desperation. "Please, just make it quick," she whispered, her voice trembling. John's heart clenched. He had no idea what she meant by that. Was she asking for him to kill her? Or was she asking for something else? Something he couldn't yet understand. Before he could process it, the other two men on horseback dismounted. They began to circle around him, their eyes filled with malice. It was clear they weren't going to leave without a fight. The woman's voice shook again, louder this time. "Please, just make it quick." John took a step forward, his rifle still in his hands. He was no hero, and he knew this wasn't his fight to begin with, but something in her words, in her fear, made him hesitate. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her eyes, or the quiet plea for help that he couldn't ignore. But John did the unthinkable. He dropped the rifle. The sound of the gun hitting the ground was loud in the still morning air, but it wasn't the only sound. The woman gasped in surprise. The men on horseback were confused, unsure of what was happening. But John didn't care. His decision was made. Instead of reaching for the gun again, John took another step toward the woman, closing the distance between them. He could feel the tension rising, but in that moment, he wasn't a rancher anymore. He was a man making a choice. "Get behind me," John said, his voice soft but strong. He held out his hand toward the woman, his eyes meeting hers. The woman hesitated, her eyes wide with disbelief. But then she stepped forward, moving behind him as he placed himself between her and the men. The men on horseback didn't know what to make of this. John stood tall, his back straight, his eyes never leaving the burly man in front of him. "Leave her alone," John said, his voice steady. "She's under my protection now." The man on the horse sneered at John, his hand still resting on the handle of his gun. John could see the anger in the man's eyes, the way his fingers twitched, eager for a fight. John knew this situation could turn violent quickly, but he wasn't backing down. His instincts told him to protect the woman no matter what. The air between them crackled with tension, and for a brief moment everything seemed to freeze. John didn't move, but his heart raced. He wasn't a lawman. He was just a rancher, used to working the land, not dealing with men like these. But something in the woman's eyes, the raw fear, the desperation, stirred something deep inside him. This wasn't just about her. It was about doing what was right. John had lived a hard life, but he'd always tried to live with honor, and in this moment, protecting the woman, standing up to these men, felt like the only thing that mattered. The burly man on the horse spoke again, his voice low and threatening. "I don't know what you think you're doing, old man, but this woman is our business. You'd best step aside before you regret it." His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring John to make the first move. John didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on the man, his body still and firm. He had nothing to prove to these men, but he wasn't about to let them take the woman either. "I said, leave her alone," John repeated, his voice steady, but there was a firmness in it that made the man pause. The other two riders, still circling, watched closely, unsure of how to respond. John could feel the woman's presence behind him, but he didn't dare turn around. She needed him to stay strong. The man with the scar sneered again and slid off his horse. "You really think you can stop us?" He took a step forward, drawing his gun slowly, clearly testing John's resolve. John's hand hovered near his holster, ready, but he didn't pull the gun. Instead, he took a deep breath, his mind working quickly. He had to think of a way to resolve this without a fight. He didn't want violence. He wanted to protect the woman and get her somewhere safe. But these men weren't going to make it easy. They weren't here to talk. "I don't want any trouble," John said, his voice calm but clear. "Just let her go. You can walk away and that'll be the end of it." The burly man didn't seem to care about peace. He took another step toward John, his hand tightening on the gun. The other two men, sensing the danger, dismounted and moved to flank John, slowly closing in. John knew he didn't have much time. If they attacked, he would have to fight. But he wasn't afraid. The woman, still standing behind him, spoke softly. "Please, just make it quick." Her words, spoken so quietly, almost broke John's resolve. What was she asking of him? Did she really want him to kill her attackers, or was it something deeper, something more complicated than that? Her voice trembled, but there was also a strength in it, a strength John hadn't expected to hear. John's gaze softened for just a moment, and he glanced back at her. He could see the terror in her eyes, but there was something else too, a quiet resignation. Whatever she had been through, it had brought her to this point, where she had no hope left. She was willing to face anything, even death, just to escape the men chasing her. But John wasn't ready to let that happen. "No," John said firmly, turning back to face the men. "I won't let them hurt you." The burly man's patience had run out. With a curse, he raised his gun and aimed it directly at John. The sound of the hammer clicking back echoed in the morning stillness, sending a jolt through John's body. Before the man could pull the trigger, something unexpected happened. A shot rang out from a distance, sharp and clear, a warning shot that made everyone freeze. The sound came from behind the men, from a ridge just beyond John's cabin. The men on horseback turned toward the sound, their hands instinctively going to their guns. But John didn't move. He knew that sound. It was the sheriff's office, and they had arrived. The burly man cursed loudly, looking furious. "This isn't over, rancher," he shouted, but John didn't respond. He wasn't worried about the men anymore. He turned to the woman behind him and put a hand on her shoulder, guiding her away from the confrontation. "We need to get inside," John said softly, his voice reassuring but urgent. The woman nodded, still looking at the men, her face pale. She had seen so much in her life that even now, when things seemed to be going in her favor, she couldn't let go of the fear. John didn't wait. He led her quickly toward the cabin, his eyes on the men as they continued to argue with the approaching sheriff's posse. The woman followed him without a word, trusting him but still unsure of what would come next. Inside the cabin, John closed the door behind them and locked it, keeping a careful eye out the window. The woman was still shaking, her body tense. John didn't know what to say. They had been so close to violence, so close to losing everything, but now with the law on their side, they had a chance. The woman sank into a chair near the fire, her hands trembling in her lap. John stood by the door, his mind racing. He couldn't help but wonder who these men were, what had driven the woman to run from them. And most of all, why had she said those words, "Just make it quick"? The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and something else, something darker, as though she had seen things that no one should have to see. She opened her mouth to speak, but John held up a hand, silencing her. "We'll talk later," John said quietly. "Just take a minute to breathe. We're safe for now." But the question lingered in the air. What had brought her to this point? What had she been running from, and why had she begged him to end it all so quickly? For the first time in a long while, John realized he didn't have the answers. He could protect her, but he didn't know the full story. And deep down he wondered if he ever would. But one thing was clear. For now he would stand by her no matter what. John stood by the window, watching the lawmen approach. The sound of their horses' hooves grew louder, and for a moment he wondered if they were really there to help, or if they would just make things more complicated. He could hear the distant shouting of the burly man and his companions, but John didn't pay them any mind. He kept his focus on the sheriff's posse, his thoughts spinning as he tried to make sense of everything. The woman was sitting by the fire, still shaken, but trying to compose herself. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles white from the tension. She hadn't spoken much since they'd gotten inside, only a few quiet words of thanks, but it was clear she was fighting something deep inside herself, some kind of fear, maybe regret. John couldn't help but feel sorry for her. He had only just met her, but something about the way she carried herself, the way she looked at him as if he were her last hope, struck him. She didn't belong in this dangerous world, and yet here she was, dragged into a fight she hadn't chosen. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, followed by a voice calling out from the other side. "It's Sheriff Brooks." "Open up." John's heart skipped a beat. He knew the sheriff. Not well, but well enough. Sheriff Brooks was a decent man, someone who upheld the law. But John also knew that sometimes the law didn't move as quickly as it should, and things often got complicated. The sheriff had his hands full already with the lawless men in the area. He walked over to the door and unlocked it, pulling it open just a crack. Sheriff Brooks was standing there. A tall man with a weathered face and a badge shining on his chest. He had a hand resting on the revolver at his side, but his eyes weren't filled with anger, just concern. Behind him, the other men from the posse stood watching the cabin carefully. "Morning, John," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Mind if we come in?" John stepped aside to let them in, his eyes quickly scanning the group. The sheriff was accompanied by two deputies, both young men who looked like they were ready for a fight, but there was a certain caution in their movements. They had heard the commotion, and now they were here to deal with it. As they entered, John closed the door behind them, keeping his attention on the woman. She hadn't moved from her seat by the fire, but she was watching the men closely, her eyes darting between John and the sheriff. "I'm sure you know what this is about," Sheriff Brooks began, his voice calm but firm. "We got a call about a group of outlaws causing trouble in these parts. One of them said something about a woman running from them. Is she the one?" John nodded, not wanting to say too much just yet. He didn't know how much the woman wanted to reveal, and it wasn't his place to speak for her. He turned to her, giving her a silent nod of encouragement. It was her choice now. The woman swallowed hard, her eyes locked on the sheriff. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I'm the one they're after." Sheriff Brooks nodded, his expression softening. "We're here to help, ma'am. You don't have to worry about them anymore. We'll make sure they're taken care of." The woman's shoulders slumped in relief, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. John could see the tension in her body start to ease, but there was still a shadow in her eyes. It was clear she wasn't out of danger yet. The sheriff's posse might take care of the men for now, but she still had a past to confront, one that she wasn't ready to face. "What's your name, ma'am?" The sheriff asked, his voice gentle, trying to put her at ease. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers still twisting in her lap. Finally, she looked up, meeting his gaze. "Sarah," she said, her voice small but steady. "Sarah Miller." John could see that it took a lot for her to speak her name, as if even the smallest details of her life were too much to share. Sheriff Brooks gave a nod, then turned his attention back to John. "You did the right thing stepping in like that. Those men are dangerous, and they won't stop until they get what they want." He paused, looking John over with a thoughtful gaze. "But there's something more to this, isn't there? You wouldn't have risked your life for her if it was just a matter of some outlaws chasing a woman." John didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. He didn't want to get Sarah involved in more trouble than she was already in, but the sheriff wasn't looking for an answer. He had seen enough to know that there was more to the story. "It's all right," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "You don't have to tell me now, John, but if you're involved in this, you'll need to be careful. Those men won't just forget about you." John nodded, understanding the sheriff's meaning. He had put himself in the line of fire, and now he had to face whatever came next. But in that moment, he realized something. He didn't regret it. He had made a choice, one that he stood by no matter the cost. The sheriff turned to Sarah. "We're going to need a full statement from you, ma'am. What happened? Why were they after you?" Sarah stiffened again, her hands twisting together in her lap. She opened her mouth to speak but seemed to lose her words, her face pale with fear. The memory of whatever had happened to her was too fresh, too painful to relive. John stepped forward, his voice calm and firm. "Maybe it's best if we give her some time," he said gently. "She's been through a lot." Sheriff Brooks seemed to understand. He looked at Sarah for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. We'll take it slow." He turned to his deputies, giving them a silent signal to step outside for a moment. John and Sarah were left alone in the cabin, the quiet feeling heavier now, filled with unspoken thoughts. John stood near the window, watching the deputies speak quietly with the sheriff, their voices muffled. Sarah was still sitting by the fire, her eyes lost in thought. "You don't have to tell me everything," John said after a while, his voice soft but steady. "But if you need help, if you need to talk about what happened, I'm here." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something else, something John couldn't quite place. She was a stranger, but in some way they were connected now. She had trusted him and he had made the choice to stand by her. I don't know how to say it," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll tell you when I'm ready. I just need some time." John nodded. He didn't press her any further. It wasn't his place to force her into revealing something she wasn't ready to share. For now, they were safe. And that was all that mattered. The sun had fully risen, casting a warm golden light over the cabin as John watched the sheriff's men ride off in the distance. They had taken the 3 outlaws with them, bound for the local jail, and for now the danger had passed. But John knew it wasn't over. The men who had chased Sarah were only a small part of something bigger, and as much as he wanted to believe everything would calm down now, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were just getting started. Inside the cabin, Sarah sat quietly by the fire, her hands still trembling in her lap. She hadn't said much since the sheriff had left, and John respected her silence. She had been through something terrible, something he didn't fully understand yet. He could see it in the way she flinched at every sound, the way her eyes darted nervously whenever she heard a horse's hoofbeats in the distance. She was still running even though she was physically safe. John walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the open land outside. The breeze had picked up, rustling the tall grass and carrying the scent of the wild plains. Everything looked peaceful, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the horizon. After a few moments, he turned back to Sarah, who had remained motionless by the fire. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. He had wanted to ask her more about what had happened, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Pushing her too hard would only drive her further away. Instead, he took a deep breath and walked over to the small table by the window, where a kettle of water sat, still steaming from the fire. He poured them both a cup of tea, the warm liquid a small comfort in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. He walked over to Sarah, holding out a steaming cup in front of her. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but still filled with that same quiet strength. She hadn't spoken much since the sheriff had left, but her gaze held a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Here," John said softly. "I thought you might like something warm." Sarah took the cup without a word, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment. The brief touch sent a jolt through him, but he quickly pulled his hand back, trying to push away the unexpected feeling. This wasn't the time for distractions. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. John could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on them, but he didn't want to break it too soon. Finally, Sarah set the cup down gently on the table and looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't mean to drag you into this." John shook his head. "You didn't drag me into anything. I made a choice. I'm not sorry for that." She looked at him for a moment as if weighing his words. Then her gaze dropped to the floor. "It's just, I never wanted to bring anyone into this. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But I don't know how to get out. I've been running for so long." John felt a pang of sympathy for her, the weight of her words sinking in. He could only imagine how exhausting it must have been, to live in fear every day, always looking over your shoulder, never knowing who you could trust. "Who are they?" John asked, his voice soft but firm. "Why were they after you?" Sarah closed her eyes, her face tightening as if the question had opened up a painful wound. She took a deep breath before speaking, her words slow and deliberate. They're part of a group that runs illegal operations across the border," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I worked for them as a maid. I didn't know what they were doing at first, but then I found out and I tried to leave. I didn't want to be part of it anymore, but when they found out I knew, they came after me." John listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. "What kind of operations?" Sarah's face twisted with disgust and she shook her head, as if she didn't want to say it aloud. "They smuggled goods, people. They ran a network for all sorts of illegal things, drugs, guns, and they used women like me to help with their business. They thought we'd never say anything. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed with them any longer." John's heart sank as he processed her words. He had no idea what she had been through, what kind of hell she had escaped from. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her, to have been caught in that world, trapped with no way out. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I had no idea." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand as if ashamed to let him see her weakness. "I didn't want to put you in danger," she said, her voice cracking. "I should have kept running, but when I saw you, I didn't know what to do. I just needed someone to stop them. I didn't know where else to turn." John felt a surge of protectiveness for her. She had been through so much, and yet here she was, standing before him, asking for nothing but a chance to be free. He couldn't turn his back on her now. "You don't have to apologize," John said, his voice steady. "You're safe here for now. They won't get to you, not while I'm around." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something else, something he couldn't quite place. It was a look that told him she didn't trust easily, that she had been hurt too many times to believe anyone could protect her. But there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, just a tiny glimmer, and that was all John needed to see. For a long time they sat in silence, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows on the walls, and John felt the tension slowly start to ease. though he knew this was only the beginning. The danger wasn't gone. The men who had been chasing her wouldn't give up easily, but for now they had a small victory. For now she was safe. "I'll make sure they never come back," John said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "You're not alone in this." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. John gave her a reassuring smile, though the weight of what lay ahead still hung over him. But for the first time since this all began, he felt a sense of purpose. He had made a choice, and he wasn't backing down. He would protect her no matter what it took. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But together they might just make it through. The days that followed were filled with tension, but also a sense of quiet determination. John didn't talk much, and neither did Sarah. They had both been through too much to speak easily about the past. But there was a new understanding between them, a quiet bond that had formed in the wake of the chaos. Sarah had begun to trust John little by little, and John had promised himself that he would protect her, no matter the cost. They spent their days in relative peace, though John kept a watchful eye on the horizon, never quite sure when the next trouble might come. The land around his ranch was vast, and it was easy for someone to slip in unnoticed. He made sure to check the fences, sharpen his rifle, and keep the cabin door locked when night fell. But despite all the precautions, it was hard to shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. Sarah had settled into a quiet routine. She helped John with chores around the cabin, though she seemed hesitant at first. She wasn't used to being in one place for long, to staying somewhere she could feel safe. It took time for her to realize that for now, she wasn't being hunted. She began to relax, even letting her guard down around John, though there were still moments when her eyes would drift to the horizon and a shadow would cross her face. One afternoon, as John worked on the porch repairing a broken railing, Sarah came outside with a bucket of water. She set it down beside him, her face looking a little more at ease than it had in days. I thought I'd thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. She hadn't said much lately, and John could see that this was hard for her. Thanking someone, especially him, seemed like a struggle, as though she had to remind herself it was okay to let people help her. John wiped his hands on his pants and looked up at her. "No need for thanks," he said, his voice steady. "You've been through enough. Just keep yourself safe." Sarah nodded, but there was something in her eyes. A question, maybe, or a thought she hadn't fully worked out. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she should say more, but finally spoke. "I know you promised to protect me, and I believe you, but I don't want to keep hiding forever. I've been running from them for so long, and I don't know how much longer I can keep looking over my shoulder." John leaned back against the post, thinking for a moment. He understood her need for freedom. He knew what it felt like to be trapped in a corner, unable to escape. But what she was asking for, it wasn't something John could give her just yet. Not without risking both their lives. "You don't have to hide here forever," John said gently, though his words carried a weight. "But you can't go back to them, Sarah, not now. They won't let you go. And if we try to face them head on, it could put both of us in danger." She looked down, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't want to go back to them," she whispered. "But I don't know what else to do. They won't stop until they get me. I've lost everything already." Her voice cracked on the last word, and John could see how much the pain of her past still haunted her. John's heart tightened. He wanted to offer her hope, but he knew the truth of the matter. "We'll figure something out," he said, though even as the words left his mouth he knew it wouldn't be easy. The men who had chased her were dangerous, and they would stop at nothing to find her. He couldn't promise her safety just yet, but he would do everything he could to protect her. The quiet stretched between them for a few moments, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Finally, Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, John," she said quietly, "for not turning me away, for not giving up on me." John gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me for that," he replied. "I made a promise, and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah seemed to take comfort in his words, her shoulders relaxing just a little. She reached down to pick up the bucket again, and for the first time in days, John saw a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days passed, John and Sarah grew more comfortable around each other. There were still moments of tension, still the shadow of fear hanging over them, but slowly they began to settle into a quiet rhythm. John was patient with her, giving her space when she needed it and letting her take charge of certain things when she felt capable. She seemed to find a small sense of peace in the routine of working together on the land. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sarah spoke again, this time with a note of finality in her voice. "I can't keep running forever. John," she said, her gaze fixed on the fading light, "I need to face them. I need to put an end to this." John turned to her, surprised by her words. He had expected her to be more hesitant, but there was a determination in her voice that he hadn't heard before. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "It won't be easy, and they won't just let you go." Sarah nodded, her face set in a firm expression. "I've already lost so much, but I can't live the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when they'll find me. I need to take control. I need to face them." John thought about it for a moment. He knew it wasn't going to be simple, and he wasn't sure they were ready for what lay ahead. But Sarah had made up her mind. She was done hiding, and he couldn't blame her for that. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll face them together, but we do it on our terms. We'll make a plan, and we won't be caught off guard again." Sarah gave him a small smile, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity, "for being here, for helping me." John nodded, his own thoughts turning to the next steps. They still had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time in days he felt a sense of hope. Together they would face whatever came their way. The sun had fully set now, leaving behind only the soft glow of the stars in the sky. It was peaceful, quiet, and for a brief moment John allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this. But deep down, he knew that the true test was still ahead. And when it came, they would be ready.